So I think we can start. Most of our people have joined by now.
Yes.
So we are at chapter 12 and 13 today is what today we'll be focusing on chapter 12 and 13. Before we move on, a quick recap. 10 and 11 were the chapters we did last time, and the focus was on Jephthah. We also saw some of the minor judges. We see how Jephthah is actually sandwiched between five of the minor judges. That is, before the story of Jephthah, we had Tola and Jair. And today, the latter portion of today's lesson, we will see three more minor judges. We won't focus on them too much. We spoke about what role they played in the narrative last time. Except to just look at the period of the minor judges and Jephthah are characterized by things. So we should not lose the flow of the book of Judges when we move chapter by chapter and focus on uh, different judges and different people. We should not forget the overall flow and the summary that was there in Judges chapter 2. So what we see a trend of Israelites losing their sense of acknowledgement of God's sovereignty over them. And the manifestation of that is in terms of, we see that they are raising their own judges. The judges rose up, the people elect their own judges, which is different from the earlier period where God raised up the judges. We also saw, especially in the period of Jephthah, that this canonization of Israel is accelerating. They have Earlier we saw how they've assimilated worship of Baal and Ashtoreth. And in Jephthah, we see a step up on the accelerator. They have now absorbed the gods of all the surrounding nations. So much so that they have even stopped worshiping God. So it is not Yahweh along with the gods of the Canaanites, it's now the gods of everybody. And Yahweh is perhaps even on the backseat or even forgotten. And we also see that one more manifestation, which is Israel is drifting towards a dynastic monarchy. God's intent for Israel was that he would be their king, he would be their judge. But we see a drift towards dynastic monarchy, and that's where Judges comes before Ruth and before Samuel and Kings, where we see that they go towards a king. And some of the hints of that is when we looked at the minor judges, there's an extensive focus on the children and grandchildren of the judges. So it's establishing, and then the number of donkeys they had. Donkeys were a sign of their power. The listing of the number of cities they ruled over. So those are some of the trademarks that we see that are listed along with the minor judges. So from that, we can make this conclusion that they are drifting towards a dynastic monarchy. But through it all, we see God remaining faithful and merciful. So much so that though he says that you have turned away from me, now you turn to the other gods and let them deliver you, he still uses Jephthah to deliver Israel from the Ammonite oppression. That's what we saw in last time's lesson. And just a word of caution throughout Judges that we will just focus a little more on that in the next slide. But Jephthah, though he is a deliverer, an instrument in God's hand, we see his limitations as a leader. Whenever he is empowered by the Spirit of God, led by the Spirit of God, he does good. But whenever he is led by his own wisdom, we see his limitations. And we saw how he made a rash vow that condemned his only daughter to be sacrificed, thus ending his family line. So sacrificed here, we felt it was more dedication to temple service rather than a human sacrifice, as in killing her. And we didn't mention this much, but in last time's lesson, Jephthah's daughter actually stands out as a model of devotion. And she willingly submits her life to keep up her father's oath that he made to Yahweh, rash as it was. And before we go into today's chapter, a quick overview of Judges chapter 12. Judges chapter 12 starts off with, it's a continuation of the Jephthah story. And we see Ephraim back on the scene in the Ephraimites, and in a way similar to how they confronted Gideon. We'll see some of their characteristics showing up again. And through this confrontation, what we see is Though they are brethren, they are tribes belonging to the family of the Israelite tribe, belonging to the family of Jacob. When brothers do not submit to the authority of God, they cannot live in unity. So, whenever this mutual submission, common submission to the authority of God goes away, you feel human characteristics. We see human characteristics coming to the front. Ephraim, we see feels more entitled than the other tribes. They feel that they have a larger share of everything. And they're even willing to murder for it. We will see this time. They threaten to kill Jephthah and his family. And we also see Jephthah, as much as we saw a good part of him last time and some of his weaknesses, this time we see Jephthah and the Gileadites are also so unforgiving. They are not willing to forgive an insult that the Ephraimites make against them. And so much so that they're willing to even shed blood to avenge that insult. And that's what we will see in Judges chapter 12. And when we move to 13 starts on an interesting note. The very first verse tells us that they were under the oppression of the Philistines and for a very long period, 40 years. But one thing we will notice is that there is no mention that they turn to God, that they cry out in their oppression. So, though they're dominated, they do not cry out to the Lord. Yet, God's plan of redemption and restoration is extended to the nation of Israel. So we see in 13 how God's plan of redemption and restoration is entirely independent from the presence or absence of any repentance on the part of Israel. So it kind of tells us that earlier also, if we felt God responded to them because they repented, perhaps we need to think again. Perhaps it's just the grace of God working to the benefit of the most undeserving people, right? So from this, to me it stood out, right? I was just recalling the parable that Jesus told when he was asked, why was he associating with sinners and uh, prostitutes and tax collectors and all the so to uh, in the worldly eyes the unworthy people. He told them a parable which had three lost elements: the lost coin that was oblivious to its lostness, the wandering sheep that got lost because it wandered away, and the willfully wayward son. And in all three elements of lostness, God's plan of redemption extended to them. So even here in 13, we will see, though Israel is lost and they are not calling out, they are like the lost coin, they are oblivious to their lostness, God's grace extends to them. And then we are moving to Samson. Samson is probably one of the most whitewashed and popular heroes, right? In all your Sunday school lessons, we study about his strength and all of that. But there is a caution. You must remember chapter 2 of Judges, which is there's a big caution there. Judges is not about Israel's heroes, it is about God's faithfulness and mercy. So we saw how Gideon, Jephthah, and we will see how Samson, they're all fatally flawed, but they were still used by God. In this today's study, we will see how Samson was chosen right from conception. And he was chosen as the beginning of a long plan of deliverance. So we see that God's plans are long term and it starts right from the womb, right? And then in today's portion, we will also see how the perfect deliverer had to be holy and set apart. That's what we'll focus on in today's lesson. And the question remains for us. That question is, can a mere man ever be a deliverer? Probably this is leading to something, a much bigger picture that is answered for us in the New Testament. So having said that, let's move to our first question for the day. So let's focus on the feeling of entitlement among the Ephraimites. So in that first portion, verses 1 to 7, we see how the Ephraimites come to Jephthah and confront him. In fact, they not confront him, they threaten to murder him. So what were the complaints that they had against Jephthah? And how does it relate to their confrontation with Gideon earlier in Judges chapter 8? So what do you think is the reason for their sense of entitlement? And then the next question, the following question that would come immediately is, did Gideon or Jephthah deal with the situation better? What are your thinking? What's your thought on this? Yeah. So let's take a look at the portion a little more. So, so there are some things that I would say I share the same view that you have, that it's difficult to figure out some things sometimes. But we can look at the text and make some direct inferences from the text. So when you look at the portion in Judges 8 and in 12, from 8:1, we can make a direct inference that the Ephraimites had an inflated sense of importance. They were unwilling to give a larger share of glory of the victory against Midian to Gideon and the other tribes. And they were, to make their point, they were very violent and aggressive. We see that they confronted Gideon very aggressively. And in today's portion, we see another aspect, that is the jealousy and hurt pride, that Jephthah could win the battle even without their help. So they probably were holding off for a more elevated position or a more formal invitation or whatever, because we see that Jephthah extended the invitation to them to join them, and they stood away. They held their hand. So, but then Jephthah goes ahead and wins the battle with the Lord's help, and that hurt them. That hurt their pride. And in their anger, so jealousy and pride, hurt pride very often provokes to anger, right? And in their anger, they were willing to commit mass murder. So much we can infer directly. Speculatively, reading between the lines, we can reason what is the reason for the sense of entitlement. And some things, some clues are there, like you all spotted that Israel was, Israel's great hero, right? Joshua, who led them, and he was the battle hero, like Moses was, who led them out of Egypt and all the way to the border of the promised land. But of the last few years, it's Joshua who was center stage, and Ephraim was from their tribe. Uh, Joshua was from their tribe, so probably that gave them a sense of entitlement. Second is, we see that they claim they're a larger tribe. Probably it also comes from their recollection of the promise that Joseph would have a double share of the inheritance. Remember, Jacob, when he blessed his children, promised a double share of the inheritance to Joseph. And Ephraim and Manasseh were Joseph's children. So they felt they were a larger tribe and they deserved more. They were entitled to better and more. And from Gideon's battle, and probably even here, so one of the material interests in a battle is the booty, right? What you get from the spoils of the battle. Probably they wanted a larger share of the spoils of the battle victory. So that's why they were negotiating for a better position in the battle, for more recognition. And we also saw, like Suma pointed out, there's a sense of superiority, ingrained sense of superiority that they have. One, that others will not be able to do it without us. And second, also that cultural superiority that the Gileadites are mere refugees in Ephraim. Who is Jephthah after all? He's just the son of a prostitute. So they taunt the Gileadites with that, with their sense of superiority. So much we can see when we look at their complaints, and we can see as their possible reasons for their sense of entitlement. The big question, so who was right? So if it, at our levels of analysis, we could analyze and see good and bad in both. Like we saw, Gideon was more diplomatic. A harsh answer turns away wrath. But a problem that is not addressed will only fester and grow. So both were right. Gideon was more forthright. So Gideon is more diplomatic and worldly wise. But remember last time in his response to the Ephraimites, he fails to acknowledge God's role. He only used his knowledge of human psychology to address the problem. Jephthah is more forthright, but we see the bad part. He's bloodthirsty in his desire for vengeance against an insult, right? In all of this, we can see the missing element is there is no common recognition and submission to God's sovereign authority over Israel. That is falling apart. And when that falls apart, brothers cannot live together in trust and harmony. Probably that is what the author in Judges is trying to point us to. Okay? So let's move to the second question. When we move to chapter 13, the first portion is when the angel of God comes to Manoah's wife and then tells her something. And along with what he prophesies, he also puts down some conditions. What were the prenatal, that is before Manoa's wife delivers a child, during the period of a pregnancy, there were some conditions the Lord imposed. What is the significance of these conditions in the plan God had for Samson? That's the next question. So what were these conditions and what's the significance? What do the conditions point to? Like, yes, I think the key aspects came out in the chat and what Santosh said. Three key aspects. One is when we compare with the Nazarite vow, which is described in Numbers, we see that the Nazarite vow was a voluntary vow and it was temporary. In the sense that the Israelites were not forced to take a vow, but those who wanted to dedicate themselves to the service of the Lord for a period of time had to do it by taking this vow. And the vow involved three conditions. No wine or strong drink. The hair must not be cut, it must grow long. And the Nazarite must separate himself or herself. In Numbers, we see that women are not exempt from this, right? It was open to them also. So the Nazarite must separate himself or herself from anything that defiles. And death was something that defiles, right? And so there was also a provision of, in case a defilement happened, unconsciously or consciously, because of circumstances that could not be avoided, you could actually get yourself purified, cleansed, and then restart your vow again. When we come to Judges, the things that stand out is, one, the vow was by mandate, and it was imposed on Manoah's wife by mandate, and it was a godly mandate. So the conditions were similar: no wine or strong drink, no food that is ritually unclean, never cut your son's hair. Second, the child had to be dedicated for a lifelong service. So it's not, the temporariness has gone away. It's a dedication for lifelong service. And the mandate started from conception to Samson's, it extended till Samson's death, right? So these are, when you compare the Nazarite vow, how it was, and the way it was implemented in this case, we see this long, some of these key differences, similarities as well as differences. And just remember always that the scripture is always pointing, is God's gradual revelation of himself, right? Through all of this, God is revealing himself. And so that's what we have to look for. What is God pointing us to? So in going by the statement that the scripture is consistent, we will see consistent imagery and representations, foreshadowing happening. Okay. So second part of the question, what's the significance of the conditions in the plan God had for Samson? Some things stand out. One is, God chose a barren woman and promised her a son. So his plan for a man includes even the conception in the womb, right? So God has ownership of the womb of the woman too, right? And so in Psalms, David echoes the same thing, right? In Psalms 139:16, when he says, "Your eyes saw me when I was inside the womb. All the days of my life are ordained for me and recorded in your scroll before even one of them came into existence." So God's sovereignty extends right from preconception stage to conception and all through your life. And the second is, the Nazarite conditions that were mandated was a form of a spiritual diet that emphasized how they had to be separated to God's purpose. So separation was so that you could be used for God's purpose. And the diet that Manoah's wife had to take on was a spiritual diet. So let's look at that a little deeper. Abstinence from drink. She was asked not to take wine or strong drink. So the freedom from any bondage and influence that wine could have on you was so that her son could be under the control of God's spirit. So you have to free yourselves, keep yourself free from any other spirit so that you could be controlled by God's spirit. Second, ritual impurity. So you have to be free from impurity so that you could maintain an unbroken fellowship with God. third, never cut your son's hair. So the hair is a very visible part of your body, right? And long hair stands out. So it's a public testimony that you are separate unto God for his purpose. So the the conditions of the Nazarite vow, the conditions that were laid on Manoah's wife, and the conditions that were laid indirectly on Samson before his birth, emphasized that he had to be separate for God's purpose. So that's the significance that we can see, right? Samson was to be dedicated to God right from birth. He was to be a lifelong Nazarite. And God would begin the delivery. If you read 13 verse 5 carefully, God says he will begin the delivery of Israel with Samson. He doesn't say he will complete it. So the plan is a long drawn, long plan that will extend to many generations, right? So that's the other significance that we can see from this portion. So let's move on to the third question. So this angel is quite different, right? It's an angel who speaks very few words. Some of the answers are very curt: yes, no, do as I said. So consider the questions that Manoa had for the angel. How did the angel respond to these questions? So one is, every answer was pointing to something beyond just the literal meaning of the questions. So what were the angel's messages and responses pointing towards, right? So that's the next question for us to deliberate on. Yeah, like Manu also says, like, looks like the angel was a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ in this portion. That is a strong school of thought, and I'm also inclined towards that. And yeah, whenever there's this, so one clue that we can look for is when we read the portion, in Hebrew, there are many ways of referring to God, right? There can be the generic Elohim or Adonai. But whenever in the English translation you see the Lord, Lord, capitalized, it's usually referring to the God of the Israelites, Yahweh, right? So that's one thing that we can search for. So the writer keeps referring to the Lord as Lord in capital letters, as Yahweh. Manoa and his wife keep shifting between Adonai and Elohim. So let's look at Manoah's questions, right? The first is Manoah's prayer in verse 8. He prays to God, asking him that this person will come back again. So the question that he has is probably, who is this man who appeared to my wife? My wife says he looks like an angel, right? God answered his prayers, and he gets to see this angel face to face. In verse 12, Manoah's question is, how are we to raise this child that will be born to us? Yeah, like Santosh said, is he going to be a king? What do we do? So the answer is very terse: just obey the instructions. Verse 15, Manoah is extending hospitality, right? He's saying, please accept my gratitude for this great thing that you have prophesied for us. And it's his offer is a secular hospitality. It's part of their culture. Eat a meal before you leave. Don't go without eating a meal, right? And the angel is gently pointing him elsewhere. He's telling him, you do not realize who I am. It's not a meal that I want. It's not your secular hospitality that I want. Instead, offer a sacred spiritual meal instead. You can offer a burnt sacrifice to God, right? The next thing is your message. Manoah tells the angel, your message shows that you're a prophet. So again, he's seeing him as a human, a different human in some way, human person. Looks like you're a prophet. Tell us your name, so that when what you said comes true, we can make your name famous. We can tell people, we can bring honor to your name when your prophecy comes true. And the angel answers in a way that tells him that you're a part of a plan so much greater. Manoah, you just are not realizing. You're just a part of a plan that's so much greater than you, and you cannot fully comprehend it. Okay? Neither do you need to comprehend it. Just trust and obey. So when we look at this back and forth, what is it pointing to probably? So when we look at it, we can see clearly that God's plan of deliverance is a long plan, that we may not comprehend the boundaries of the plan, right? It extends far beyond the horizons of our vision. Second, the plan starts from conception before we are even conscious about it. It requires you to be set apart. To be a part of the plan, you require to be a set apart deliverer. And can you be that holy deliverer? It encompasses, it extends to the entire lost nation, whether they realize they need it or not. We saw this time God's plan spans generations, right? It's not just one person. And through those generations, God will reveal his hand. The next thing that we can see from the angel's response is that God is the deliverer. Though Samson is part of the plan, it's actually God who's the deliverer. That's why the character and nature of God is more important than the specific name. You want to know my name? That's not more important. It's too wonderful for you to comprehend. Isaiah, the same word that is used. In fact, when Manoa asks him what is his name in Hebrew, it appears like he's stammering. Now he's so overtaken, so overcome, that he stammers and starts with who is your name? And that's the Hebrew verse actually, right? And the angel's response is, my name is too wonderful for you to comprehend. The word that is used there is the same word used by Isaiah to prophesy the coming of Jesus. And he says, he shall be called the wonderful counselor. It's the same word, the wonderful word that's used there. So clearly, the angel's answers were pointing beyond Manoah, beyond Samson, pointing to the deliverer rather than the instrument. Okay? Next question. Manoah and his unnamed wife. Throughout this chapter, if you have noticed, we don't have a name to call her by. We just stuck on referring to her as Manoah's wife or Samson's mother. Yet she has a big role to play, right? Manu points out one of the attributes of our God is he is incomprehensible. This is in line with our previous question. That's very true. So we will not be able to comprehend God fully. Thank you, Manu. Coming back to the question, Manoah and his unnamed wife. So throughout this chapter, Manoah's wife has a major role to play, yet she is unnamed. What is your opinion about Manoah's wife and her role in the story? We will also touch on, when we look at the answer to this question, on some of the things that Sujit had brought out. The relation between Manoah's wife and the vision she has, and the vow that she has to take to Zechariah and Elizabeth and John the Baptist. Okay, so the chat lights are open for this question. Anybody else?
Yeah, one quick thought, and you rightly put the question here that, Manoah's wife is playing a major role. And I think we can see that throughout chapter 13, right? Especially what is interesting for me is that for the Manohar's question about what must the boy do, what kind of life must he lead, the answer is not here are the 15 things the boy needs to do, but here is the specific things his wife needs to do. So in a way, I'm probably answering question 3 here. It points to the fact that there is a huge role the parents have to play. It's not about how do I put my child to so and so that they can reach. It's more about what are you as parents and men and women, right, do to bring up the child, which is going to then serve the Lord, right? So that's one thing. Really, I don't think there is an importance of whether his name is named or not, because the matter of fact is she's been chosen by God himself to deliver a deliverer, a judge. Is fame enough, right? I mean, really, she's not dependent on her name to be plastered all around in the Bible even, right? So I think that is really really what is it's all about. And typically it's people like all of us are really focusing on names and I do this, or I have so extend the name per se, right? I mean, we have seen that in the judges also. Some people who started out being as judges, they wanted their names and fames, and I think they have gone the wrong way. So I think Manoah's wife will be remembered, and she did play a very critical role, and she's not really need to be named as far as I'm concerned.
Excellent. Two excellent points, actually. So, yeah. So, one is the specific things that parents, the role that parents have in God's plan, even if in God's plan for your child, right, and your family. And naming, looking for that name, observing that she's unnamed is a very human characteristic. But God sees things differently. Two very nice points, actually. Excellent. Anybody else?
I also think, to your point about, judges and humans being fallible, right? I think the tasks that God gives us, whether it is as parents or as instruments in His hands, are finite and doable, right? It is not that, He gives us tasks that we have to be perfect people. So while we may tend to think that, because we can never do right, or we look at the judges or other people in the Bible and see how they fall in between, like David itself, right, fell so many times, but yet they are still heroes of faith. So
Mm,
one way we can get discouraged and see, okay, now as humans, look at all these people, even though they were called by God, they were not faithful to the very end. On the other side, I think it's a story of God's partnership with people who are willing to step up, not because they could finish a perfect life, right? So it is not, I think that focus should not be around that, they fell. Yes, of course, that is important in the
mm,
circumstances in which they fell. But there was no exception to, in any case, other than the life of Jesus, where they were perfect.
mm,
So setting that expectation for us and taking that as a learning lesson would be a tough one on us alone, because that we would never be able to do. But it is around the task that God has given us to be faithful and work in partnership with Him. I think God works with human beings to make His work possible in this world. So I think there is both a positive learning and a negative thing. We can never be that perfect person unless we are Jesus Christ Himself, right? So uh, even with our pitfalls, I think we have to still be willing to step up, and when we fall, be willing to accept it.
very true. Actually, if I gave that very strong one-sided opinion, I stand corrected. Definitely, it is the focus is on the partnership and your role. So it's not that the tasks that we have are undoable and cannot be done. I think we'll just touch on that in the last question also, uh, when we take the breakout question. So I was just probably emphasizing one aspect because there is a tendency to look at uh, David and Samson and some of them from their human characteristics and portray them as heroes. So just caution, but I might have not emphasized the other aspect as much. So thank you, Sujit. That balance is most important, most this one. And I think if you do not have that balance, it can be discouraging, right? We can feel discouraged. Very true. So yeah, shall I just step into this question a bit? Um, we see that Manoah's wife, she was special in God's sight. So definitely it was, so to be special in God's sight, to be called out for a purpose does not need you to be named. So she was infertile and childless, but she would conceive and have a son who would be dedicated to God from birth. So along with two other chosen women who were also recorded in the scripture as being barren, but they were barren so that they were mother lifelong Nazarites. So it was a privilege. So even when there's a temporary barrenness, perhaps God is preparing you for something very special. We see that also in Hannah, the mother of Samuel, in 1 Samuel chapter 1. And we see this in Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist. So there is a relationship, definitely. And they are all related in the way God used them, and used their barrenness because He had a special purpose for them, right? We see that she was privileged because she had a pre-incarnate visitation from Jesus to announce that she would mother the future beginning of the deliverance of Israel from the Philistines. So two parts. And we also see that her spiritual caliber was very high. She was trusting and did not harbor doubts. Because when she got that first visitation, the angel appeared to her first. And when she ran to her husband, she told him, a man sent from God came to me. That was good enough for her. If you read that portion, there were two things that she said, I did not ask, I do not know. She did not need to know where he came from. She did not need to know what his name was. She confessed that she did not ask, yet his message was good enough for her. So it points to a very high, she had this ability to discern, spiritually discern that this was a word from God. And under similar circumstances, if you remember Sarah and Zechariah, similar circumstances, both in their barrenness, when God's angel appears and announces the birth of a child, the end of the barrenness, Sarah laughed and Zechariah doubted, right? She was different. She did not mock the message. She did not even doubt it. So she had a very high spiritual caliber. And like how Rajiv also pointed out, she was very logical and she was a good encouragement to her husband. It's not that her husband was a bad guy, right? He does not come out as someone who was bad. Both were devout, but she was more able to see through the picture more clearly. So she says, right, when Manoa feels that now that we have seen God face to face, we are doomed. We are doomed to die. But she points out that the Lord would not have said this, right? I mean, and shown us all that will happen in the future if it was just so that we would be killed. So I'm just paraphrasing that loosely. So, Sujita, I don't know whether we addressed the question you had about Zechariah.
Yes, I was just wondering in my mind, both seem to be pointing to a deliverer, right? So that was the parallel that I was thinking of, and I just found it, interesting that there is so much commonality between what the entire episode itself. So I was just figuring out
Yeah,
if there's more significance to it than what meets the.
yes. Both of them, yes. Both were pointing to a deliverer and both of them were pointing to people who would be lifelong Nazarites also, right? Yep. The last question, this is a breakout question. This is a personal question, right, for each of us. We see clearly that the central theme of this chapter is to be set apart, to be used by God, right? It's holiness. Like Israel, we as Christians have a mandate to be in this world but not of this world. What does that mean to you? I think what Sujit pointed out is very important when we look at this question. So it's not that we are fallible and we should give up or be discouraged, right? So what does it mean? If you read those two portions, John 17 and Romans 12, the two portions that I've called out, actually it's very encouraging. There's a promise there. When God wants us to be part of his plan, he does that along with a promise. He knows us fully and he knows our weaknesses, yet he is willing and can and will use us. And there is a promise there. So that's the intent of the question. Minnie will break us out into the breakout rooms. And before we do that, I'll just paste the question in the chat room. So this question, the last question is more personal deliberation. It's not that I have a right answer or a wrong answer to give. And but along with the question, with the two references, I just wanted to point out that the two references are very encouraging. Personally, I found them very encouraging observations. That you can be in the world but not of it. And God knows, right? So in the high priestly prayer, Jesus' high priestly prayer encompasses and empowers. It's an empowering prayer. He's not a passive observer. In that prayer, it's a continuous prayer. He's not a passive observer. He's an active enabler. So God, when he asks us to be not of the world, in the world, when God asks us not to be in the world, to be in the
Are
world
you
but
sharing?
of it.
You are
Oh,
not.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'll share the screen. I forgot. Can you see the screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry. So the two references I picked was more from the perspective of being very, personally for me, very encouraging observations, right? Jesus' high priestly prayer encompasses and empowers us. It tells us that he's not a passive observer. God is not a passive observer. He's an active enabler, right? He prayed, I'm not asking you to take them out of the world, but to keep them safe from the evil one. They do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world, right? So, and in Romans 12 also, when along with the exhortation, the plea that Paul is making to the Romans, you see that he's saying that to go by this exhortation, you have a foundation to build on that will transform us. So when he says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, there's a positive aspect to that, which is you can be transformed, you will be transformed, right? So both these portions are very encouraging, right? So it's just like what Sujit was saying, it's not that we are fallible and there is no way out. God recognizes that. And yet he wants us to be part of his plan. So that graciousness of God, the role that we have to play are very important. God is aware of all our weaknesses and he can still and he will use us. So with that, just on a lighter note, so this Not of the World, I found that is actually a company. It used to be a company called NOTW, notoftheworld.com. They've renamed it to Mardel.com. So when you look at their website, three things in that portion here, in that text, that is small text there, three things stood out. Not of the World is made of very high quality fabric. It is evangelism on the move, and you'll experience a comfortable fit. So just on a lighter note, I just wanted to leave you with these three key phrases. And so, yes, the message that stays with us for this week is be in the world, but not of the world. Our next week's study will be from Judges 14 and 15. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sushil.
Thank you.
Thank you.